No.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Totally yours, Corey.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We're going to get started with the production shortly. We have a very large file because there's very exciting animations and interactive. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We're going to get started with the production shortly. Welcome, everyone. We have a very large file because there's very exciting animations and interactive. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We're going to get started with the production shortly. Welcome, everyone. We are here in the Department of Arts Applied to Medicine. We have very exciting animations and interactive. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We're going to get started with the production shortly. We are here in the Department of Arts Applied to Medicine. We have very exciting animations and welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We're going to get started with the production shortly. We are here in the Department of Arts Applied to Medicine. We have very exciting animations and welcome, everyone, and thank you for your patience. We're going to get started with the production shortly. We are here in Department of Arts Applied to Medicine. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone in the audience who raised her hand. Who actually attended the graduated school before the program was established as a master's degree. We have someone Oh,
represents the top mold with vents on it.
My apologies.
So where were we? So going back, we made three-piece mold system for our plug. And then to make our anterior wax pattern, we printed multiple anterior wax pattern using the same photopolymer wax resin that we used. Then we cleaned them in IPA, removed all of their supports, and cured them in UV for 5 minutes, and that enhanced their physical properties. Further refinement was done using sanding, flaming, and polishing. For casting the anterior wax, a 3D printable key was made to key in with the anterior wax. The reservoir was filled with silicone to get a negative key, which once molded, keyed in with the bottom mold. And at the end, you could see the cross-section of prototype 2. When we knew that prototype 2 worked, we wanted to further streamline the fabrication process, so we created the bladder key system and redesigned it digitally and printed using castable wax 40. This eliminated the need for silicone-based manual key fabrication and improved reproducibility of the mold assembly. It also improved reservoir preservation during casting, enabled easier removal of the 3D printed reservoir. We also did some microbial testing because the prosthesis contained an internal reservoir. Microbial accumulation was a very important concern for us. To address this, we investigated chitosan as an antimicrobial internal surface lining material. Chitosan is a naturally derived biocompatible polysaccharide that's derived from crustaceans. All of the prostheses were incubated at 37 degrees Celsius and cultured on non-selective nutrient agar. Overall, the study demonstrated successful fabrication of lubricant-enhanced ocular prostheses using digital workflow and additive manufacturing. Key outcomes included successful integration of internal reservoir system, improved water tightness in prototype 2, stable casting outcomes, and preservation of the internal reservoir geometry. The antimicrobial surface modification also showed promising preliminary results with no detectable microbial growth. We also created a simulation model to evaluate the in situ prosthesis performance. The model incorporated the orbital anatomy, eyelid interaction, and a solenoid-based blink simulation system to evaluate lubricant release behavior, surface circulation, retention pattern, and anticipated refill interval over time. Testing and refinement of the simulation platform are still going. This video illustrates how the self-lubricating ocular prosthesis sits with respect to the orbital implant behind. I would like to sincerely thank my preceptor, Andrew Etheridge, my faculty members and collaborators for their guidance and support throughout this project. Thank you all for your time and attention. I would now be happy to take any questions or comments. So the question was, why did I choose to use chitosan as an antimicrobial lining? since our prosthesis was hollow inside, and since it's sitting in a socket and will be exposed to all the fluids inside the socket, the odds of developing microbial growth in it was very significant, which is why the first patent that was done by Kevin Kelly was not used very well. So to avoid the growth of microbial content in it, we use chitosan. Chitosan, like I said, is a biocompatible antimicrobial material. And since PMMA, which is the plastic that we're using to make the ocular prosthesis, have multiple microporosities in it, it harbors bacteria really easily. So if we do a coating of chitosan, it's supposed to help us in the long run by eliminating microbial adhesion.
Thank you very much. Congratulations. I guess it's probably more common. You can also try to do that.
Thank you. So every year, like I said, 300,000 people here in the United States, right? But there are so many people in India who are diagnosed with retinoblastoma every single year, and they lose their eye. My goal and objective was to help them, to be able to help them, to help as many people as I can. Since the first patent that was made was, well, 30 years ago, and we are still using our traditional ocular, and the goal was to make something that would help combat the problems that these people are facing. Thank you. I would now like to invite Melody Zhang. Melody graduated from University of California, Los Angeles with a BS in biology.
Thank you, Sneh. For my thesis, I created multimedia resources to help nurses understand ultrasound-guided blood culture collection. So, what is blood culture collection? Blood cultures are typically taken to diagnose bloodstream infections, and some common examples you might have heard of include sepsis or pneumonia. 600,000 bloodstream infections occur annually in North America, with 80,000 of these bloodstream infections leading to mortality. Blood culture contamination is a major issue in most hospitals because contamination can lead to false positives, which results in longer hospital stays and up to $12,000 in hospital costs per patient. So then why is ultrasound used for blood culture collection? For patients with more difficult to see veins, for example, in pediatrics, obese patients, or just generally patients with suboptimal veins, ultrasound can be used to find a suitable access site. However, the ultrasound-guided procedure is complex. It contains a series of sterile and aseptic steps, and this leads to the possibility of contaminants entering. For my thesis, the audience was nurses who collect blood cultures, with a secondary audience of healthcare personnel interested in ultrasound-guided blood culture collection. The objectives of my piece were to create an animated video of the procedure, going through it step by step, pointing out common points of contamination along the way, and then evaluating the materials with a pre-post survey structure. I also intended to create a quick point of care reference for nurses to use on the go. To begin, I conducted an informal needs assessment where I consulted 7 nurses who have experience educating other nurses on blood culture collection technique. These also included members of my quality improvement team. I also conducted literature review through the portal that nurses use to access their training materials. And these materials included the ultrasound and peripheral venipuncture checklists. So the ultrasound guided venipuncture checklist contains an additional 14 steps and 10 materials in addition to the standard peripheral checklist. And with more steps and more materials, that introduces more room and more cognitive load for busy nurses. And so part of my project was to eliminate some of that cognitive load. To begin, I storyboarded with Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator. I also sketched out initial concepts of my roadmap using Procreate. The roadmap is intended to serve as checkpoints for the viewer while watching the full video, and it guides them through the video in a logical and engaging flow. For my final animation, I used Adobe Illustrator and After Effects, as well as Overlord for quicker import and export between the two softwares. To conduct my survey, I began with 9 pre-test questions, asking nurses demographics as well as their experience with the procedure. Then the nurses are asked to watch a 6.5-minute video that I produced. And finally, for the post-test, they're asked the same open response questions, as well as questions to determine their level of engagement. I will now play a clip from my video.
Take the caps off from the blood culture bottles. These caps are not sterile. Bacteria can enter and contribute to blood culture contamination. Perform hand hygiene and don sterile gloves. Begin. Take the caps off from the blood culture. Begin. Take the caps off from the blood.
All right, we're gonna give this another shot. Thank you all.
Take the caps off from the blood culture bottles. These caps are not sterile. Bacteria can enter and contribute to blood culture contamination. Perform hand hygiene and don sterile gloves. This begins the sterile portion of the procedure. Place sterile gel on top of the probe, being careful not to touch other surfaces with your sterile gloves. Use your sterile gloves to hold open the outside of the sterile probe cover, reversing and sheathing the cover over the probe to maintain sterility. Secure with rubber bands. Here is a suggested sample setup. The areas in blue are and should be kept sterile. Remember to keep the aerobic bottle closest to you since it will be filled first. Insert the needle right below the probe, making sure to keep the needle at a 45-degree angle.
Next, I will show a quick reference guide nurses can use on the go. I've animated this version for the video, but it's available as a print, and it's intended for use within the hospital care units. So nursing stakeholders reviewed the video, and initial stakeholder feedback was collected from 6 sources. They stated that the video was fun and creative, and the format made it very easy to understand. They also noted that the video was unlike the style and design of other healthcare videos. And some even commented that they could perform the procedure well, despite not knowing anything about it going in. For recommendations, members of the vascular access team pointed out several portions that could be closer aligned to the wording in the ultrasound-guided venipuncture checklist I referred to for the video. The results from my survey were collected, and it showed that generally nurses who took this survey were pediatric nurses who collected blood cultures on a monthly basis with varied experience levels. Participants reported feeling more confident in the procedure after watching the video, and results were statistically significant. Overall, participants agreed or strongly agreed to these engagement and retention statements, reacting positively to my animation. In summary, through my project, I developed a 2D animation to depict a complex clinical procedure from start to finish. I created an illustrated reference guide that nurses can use on the go. I revised these materials based on stakeholder feedback. And finally, I've received significant positive feedback on the quality improvement survey I conducted. For future directions, I hope to pass this animation on to my quality improvement team to implement into hospital-wide nurse training. And after hospital-wide implementation, we will continue to track contamination rates. It'd be interesting to see if these multimedia resources are correlated with improved contamination rates within the hospital. I would like to thank my preceptor, Dr. Erica Prohaska, for her mentorship and support, my faculty advisor, Jeff, for guiding me through the thesis process, and I would also like to thank the members of the vascular access team and nursing educators on their substantial contributions to this project. I now welcome any questions or comments on my thesis.
I'm curious about how you decided on the arts of the animation. Like, is there any press coverage or survey based on like different versions of it?
So the question was how I decided on the art style for this animation. And that's a great question. We actually went through a couple of iterations. So initially I started off with a simpler style, but with the content of what I was trying to convey, I decided on a slightly more, while still stylistic, a more complex approach. I actually had 3 versions. One was a super realistic looking ultrasound. One was really just a circle instead of the vein. And then I settled on a semi-realistic, semi-stylized style as a final result. And this was talking to the stakeholders as well as my faculty advisor. Yeah, that's also a great question. So the question was, he was wondering whether phlebotomists would be able to use this for their training or background. So we've actually talked to vascular access teams as well as the infection control team. And currently we're at the stage where we're trying to get as many user results as possible from the survey before we begin hospital implementation. But I've talked to my stakeholders and they've expressed that it would be a very helpful resource for phlebotomists, for VAT team, for nurses in training.
What could be the approximate timeline if you had to like? What could be the approximate timeline if you had to implement this technique on other hospital procedures? How much time would it take for every procedure to meet such an animation?
That is a great question as well. The question was how approximately what would be the timeline for implementation? So right now our goal is to reach about 20 survey responses. And once we have that, my thesis preceptor, Dr. Erica Proska, will be speaking with the different teams. She's a member of the infectious diseases division. So she has a lot of stakeholders that she can speak to about that. As for timeline, our goal is within the next year, but depending on a lot of different factors that may or may not be possible. That's a great question. So I decided on this project because a lot of my personal goals are to break down a complex subject and turn it into something that's easily digestible for all audiences. And while my audience at this time is a pretty specialized audience of nurses, I think I was able to practice that skill pretty well and just break things down step by step. I think everyone likes to watch a really fun, clear animation, and that was my goal with this. Thank you for all your questions. I would like to introduce Ethan Gernerd. Ethan received his Bachelor of Arts in Scientific and Pre-Medical Illustration from Arcadia University.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm Ethan, and my thesis topic was the development of pediatric tracheostomy emergency response guides. Annually, there are around 4,000 pediatric tracheostomies that occur in the United States, and these patients often have severe comorbidities such as neurological impairment, congenital airway anomalies, and congenital heart disease. Since these are pediatric patients, they also have smaller airway diameters, meaning there's a higher risk of airway occlusion, mucus plugging, and respiratory distress. Post-discharge care relies entirely on non-medical caregivers such as the parents and guardians. There's a 63% readmission rate within 6 months of the procedure, a 12% mortality rate at 1 year, rising to 42% at 10 years, and 38% of deaths occur at home in this patient population, and 27% of deaths are from preventable tracheostomy accidents. The emergency events that we explored were an obstruction. So if mucus blocks the tracheostomy tube and occludes the airway, this is the most common emergency, and it can completely occlude the airway within seconds if not acted immediately. A decannulation, whether it's a partial or complete decannulation, is when the tracheostomy tube comes out of the neck. This is a high-risk emergency that requires immediate anatomical recall and physical dexterity to restore the airway. And finally, a hemorrhage, which is bleeding around the tracheostomy site or in the tracheostomy tube itself. It's a severe risk that approaches a 100% mortality rate if not managed immediately. Preparation of caregivers is highly variable and not standardized. Emergency response is taught in theory, but rarely practiced. There is no universal discharge literature across institutions, and current materials are written above a 6th grade reading level where most patient discharge material should be written at or below a 6th grade reading level. Current training materials are available, but are most commonly a list of narrative steps to follow, include specific terminology that is difficult for low health literacy populations, and do not provide visual content to guide emergency steps in a meaningful way. This is an example of the Johns Hopkins All Children's Hospital Tracheostomy Care of Infants and Children parent handout that is currently disseminated to this patient population. As you can see, it is just text and is very dense, and is also a 19-page document. The objectives of this project were to develop a simple, intuitive, visually based, quick emergency reference for caregivers of tracheostomized children in the home setting. We standardize emergency procedural steps for obstruction, decannulation, and hemorrhage, and we hope to improve the current patient discharge material at Johns Hopkins. A multi-source research consisted of peer-reviewed literature that we reviewed the Johns Hopkins current patient discharge materials, peer institution current patient discharge materials, and consultations with pediatric medicine experts. Patient discharge guides were reviewed from 6 major institutions. Of the 6 guides reviewed, there were only 2 that were pediatric focused. None used consistent visual media with an average of 0.86 images per page across the guides. Only 1 featured an emergency response, and the average page number was 37 pages. Procedural steps were organized in Figma. So left to right is obstruction, decannulation, and hemorrhage. Initially, each procedure script had 28 separate steps. Through iterative expert review, each script was distilled to less than 11 essential steps per guide, and the hemorrhage guide was broken into an external hemorrhage response and an internal hemorrhage response. All assets were sketched in Procreate and refined in Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator. Flat color and simple outlines were chosen with select spot rendering in areas of interest because they had the least extraneous load on the user. Different patient representations were also used across the different guides. Decannulation, obstruction, and hemorrhage each feature a different type of person to help distinguish between the emergencies and reduce visual repetitiveness. Symbol color redundancy was used to ensure that all icons are recognizable enough regardless of color. Red was utilized to indicate warnings and danger, and green was utilized to recognize action or safety, and as well as high spatial contiguity between the text and images to ensure high stimulus response compatibility between instruction and visual messaging. A 3-panel structure was chosen, left being preparation, center the core action, and the right being escalation. The guides utilize a 3-phase modular response framework that can be used across different emergencies as well. And as the guides progress, as acute stress increases, there's larger text and less text. This is an example of Guide 1, obstruction. We also replaced the narrative text-heavy inventory checklists that are included in these guides with a visual inventory. We utilized a high contrast yellow for its high visibility in the home setting, as well as a number indexing system for rapid identification and the actual emergency itself for a safeguarding just in case. This is an example of the guide opening. The users are first encounter the visual inventory checklist, the preparation panels, and it is designed to be laid next to the child as the procedure begins. The guides also feature entryways into other emergencies, as these emergency events often evolve into different scenarios, such as the escalation panel of Guide 1, obstruction. The next phase of action would be an emergency tracheostomy tube change. Instead, it directs the user to the appropriate guide, which would be Guide 2, decannulation. The hemorrhage guides also feature a similar functionality, where instead there's a decision tree on the folded inside portion along with the visual inventory checklist to quickly identify the source of bleeding and act accordingly. So out of the material produced, 82 individual visual assets, series of 4 emergency guides with standardized procedures, visual inventory checklists per specific emergency, a modular 3-phase response framework, and entry points into other responses as emergencies evolve. So as far as improvements are concerned, To gather caregiver insights, an IRB-approved needs analysis was developed and disseminated to 6 Facebook support groups. Engagement was limited by the need for trust building in these protected communities, and data could not be collected within the project window. We hope to reattempt outreach to get stakeholder feedback in the next phase of the project. We also hope to have a layperson's validation of the efficacy of the design, utilizing a systems usability survey to ensure the design is generalizable and approachable enough for as broad of an audience as possible. And then while all technical information was validated by clinical experts, we also would like a layperson's validation of the assets to make sure that all visual messaging is generalizable enough and broad enough for as many audiences as possible. As far as future considerations, we hope to perform a quantitative evaluation of the design and keep iterating on the designs to get them as close as possible. We hope to formalize institutional partnerships with NICU and PICU staff at Johns Hopkins for in-person stakeholder feedback. We hope to implement the revised designs in the patient discharge process at Johns Hopkins. We also hope to conduct a multi-institutional quality improvement study and develop a universal decision guide that can act as an algorithm to help the caretaker decide what emergency is happening and how to respond appropriately. So in conclusion, this project aims to directly decrease the 27% mortality rate of tracheostomy-related accidents, provide an equitable approach to health literacy. This, once again, Johns Hopkins emergency response that is provided to patients currently. And this is one of the guides that was developed in direct contrast throughout this project. Finally, we hope to simplify the cognitive effort from recognition to action. And I would like to thank my preceptors, Dr. Miller, Dr. Rosen, my wonderful advisor, Corey Sandone, and special thanks to the faculty, students, staff of Department of Art as Applied to Medicine and the Home Vent research team. I now welcome any questions or comments.
Even Butler's point is not really a question or it's always the irony of time. We're notified this morning.
That's good news. Well, yeah, hopefully, thank you.
Having worked with patients that have tracheostomies, as a caregiver, sometimes to see situations. I can't imagine my own child situation.
Thank you so much.
Was this guide used on the patients as a guide for their understanding what actually everybody for their understanding?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Was this guide used by the patient's caregiver from the hospital?
It has yet to be tested. The question was whether this guide was used at the hospital and has yet to be tested, but we hope to do that soon. Thank you.
We just wondered what inspired you to choose this.
The question was what inspired me to choose this topic. The whole reason why I wanted to pursue medical illustration was it's the best way to make health information inclusive, accessible, and to help break down barriers, especially with people who have low health literacy or English isn't necessarily their first language. So having a design that is comfortable and accessible to people and something that can directly impact people's lives is what motivates me to pursue this career. And this just happened to be exactly what I want to do. So it was a good timing. Thank you, everybody. For our next presenter, I would like to introduce Jamie Hefley. She graduated from Iowa State University with a Bachelor of Arts in Biological/Pre-Medical Illustration.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for coming. I'm excited to present to you my thesis, The Renin-angiotensin System Across the Lifespan, a visual exploration of a multi-organ hormonal network in aging and disease. For some background, the renin-angiotensin system, which I will refer to as RAS, is a key hormonal network that primarily regulates blood pressure, fluid and electrolyte balance, cardiovascular, and renal function. It functions through the release of renin from juxtaglomerular cells in the afferent arterioles of the kidney, which cleaves angiotensinogen and produces angiotensin 1. Angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, then converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2, which targets two main receptors. Activation of the angiotensin 2 type 1 receptor drives vasoconstriction, aldosterone secretion, and sodium retention, while the type 2 receptor counterregulates these effects. And it is this pathway that is the fundamental mechanism by which the body maintains circulatory stability. It's also what we typically refer to as the classical or circulating renin-angiotensin system. And this view is really important, but it doesn't fully capture the system's complexity because RAS can also function independently of circulation. It can operate at tissue-specific and even intracellular levels. So how is RAS impacted by age? Its activity doesn't simply decline, it shifts, it becomes imbalanced. Circulating RAS activity decreases while local RAS, what I spoke about on the previous slide, becomes upregulated. We see increased activation of the pro-inflammatory angiotensin 2 type 1 receptors. So what does this mean and why does it matter? Well, this dysregulation represents a pathologic shift that drives hypertension, sodium retention, oxidative stress, inflammation, and fibrosis. RAS dysregulation also contributes to hallmarks of aging and drives chronic disease, which makes it an important therapeutic target. To get a better sense of how this subject matter is taught within the medical curriculum, I consulted with several course directors here at Johns Hopkins. I learned that RAS is taught through lecture-based instruction and is fragmented across 3 courses, the renal, cardiovascular, and endocrine blocks. Available visuals are limited to static diagrams that are either oversimplified or overly dense, and content is focused on the classical cascade in blood pressure with limited or no coverage of local and aging RAS. This thesis had 3 main objectives. First, to determine learner and educator preferences and needs for RAS educational media. Second, to design and develop an interactive module that presents the RAS as a multi-organ, multi-scale system and integrates physiology with pharmacology and clinical relevance. And third, to evaluate and assess the efficacy of the module. I approached my first objective through an IRB-approved needs assessment where semi-structured interviews were conducted with learners and educators here at Johns Hopkins. My questions aimed to identify learning preferences for educational media, determine challenges and misconceptions, isolate gaps in the curriculum, and define features for improved educational resources, and this information directly informed my project direction. Production began with the development of a script, followed by ideation and wireframing in Figma. Protein structures were collected and then prepared using the PDB and Pimal, then imported into Cinema 4D using the ePMV plugin and rendered with Redshift. I created 2D illustrations and diagrams in Photoshop and Illustrator, and the final interactive was developed in Unity for WebGL and hosted on a WordPress website. Upon module completion, I conducted a second IRB-approved study with second-year medical students who, at that point, had covered all RAS-related content within the curriculum. Participants completed pre- and post-module surveys through Qualtrics, followed by semi-structured interviews on Zoom. Now let's talk about the results. The needs assessment revealed a clear need for a more comprehensive resource with strong preferences for visuals, interactivity, and clinically relevant content. Learning challenges included conceptualizing RAS activity in the body and linking information across biological scales. In response, I produced over 40 illustrations and diagrams, 7 case studies, and 17 review questions. My illustrations span circulating, local, and aging RAS topics and cover multiple biological scales from molecular, cellular, organ, and whole body contexts. This is an example of one of those illustrations featuring angiotensin II signaling in the brain. And here's another illustration of the effects of angiotensin II in the adrenal gland. All assets were then integrated into an interactive learning module for tablet and computer use. And here's a quick clip exploring a portion of the learning module. It allows linear navigation through the use of the next button at the bottom, or more of a choose your own adventure approach through the pathway overlaid the body map on the right. And you can see many of my illustrations are integrated throughout. The module goes on to offer content on local and aging RAS, RAS modifying drugs, and case studies with review questions. As for the results, self-reported understanding increased across all tested topics after module engagement, with significant improvement recorded in classic and aging categories. The module also received high Likert scale ratings across organization, duration, engagement, sufficiency, and clinical relevance. And my interviews revealed the following recurring themes. Participants found the visuals clear and effective. Module content addressed learning gaps and challenges. Supported active engagement through interactivity. Helped bridge foundational knowledge with clinical application, and was overall highly valued with some minor suggestions for improvement. Finally, future directions for this project include refinement based on study results, comparing learning outcomes with traditional teaching methods, increasing the study sample size, investigation on applying this project model to other complex biomedical topics, and integration as a resource in the medical curriculum. I would like to thank Dr. Abadir, Lydia Gregg, Dr. Helmy, the Vesalius Trust, and my classmates who all supported me in the development of this thesis. And I now welcome any questions or comments.
So Jay, I'm biased, but I think you did an amazing job. And congrats on the very complex foundation of hormonal system of the body and just making it flow variables. I wanted to ask you, we dealt with different levels of learners. Specifically, we dealt with our medical students, and I wonder how was that experience? What was interesting, surprising? When you brought in the topic of that I mentioned.
For First of all, thank you, Dr. Abadir. The question was, I got to engage with several learning groups, especially medical students, and the question asked what my experience was interacting with them and how they responded to this topic. During my survey, I had semi-structured interviews, and it was incredibly rewarding to provide this resource and receive their responses. They were very excited to have a resource like this. They mentioned that they wish they had it in other units throughout their education, like their entire endocrine unit, specifically for the renin-angiotensin system. I think one of the biggest thing was that things like renin or angiotensin, these are floating names that they hear, but often don't have a visual to connect with the name. And so having that was incredibly helpful for them in visualizing this pathway and exactly like how angiotensinogen turns into angiotensin 1, and that angiotensin 2 is a product of those. And I think that overall it helped develop their learning and retention, and I was very pleased.
But the surveys obviously asked other people, well, you didn't have this one, so was there any issues you faced in your own learning, right? Something that you try to like bring to light in this part of it?
The question was what challenges I faced in researching learning this topic myself, since I hadn't previously studied the renin-angiotensin system, and it didn't come without challenges, and I got to experience through my research what resources were available. I encountered many articles that were very helpful, but they didn't provide a comprehensive resource for all the things that I touched on. You rarely find an overview of classical RAS with an explanation of how local RAS functions and its roles throughout the body, nor do you find that paired with the effects of aging on RAS and how this pathway becomes dysregulated. So in that exploration, I recognize the need for a more comprehensive resource, but it was difficult to synthesize and this information and decide what was essential to include. I would now like to Thank you. I would now like to introduce our next presenter, Allison Abel. Allie graduated from Iowa State University with a BA in Biological Pre-Medical Illustration. Welcome, Allie.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to share my thesis, Shared Structures, Divergent Development Across Species, Three-Dimensional Visualization of Mammalian Kidney Formation. So a little bit of background. Kidneys are among the most structurally complex organs in the body, composed of many different cell types and highly convoluted tubular networks. Their development depends on two highly regulated processes: branching morphogenesis, which forms the collecting system, which includes the renal pelvis, the major and minor calyces, and the collecting ducts, and nephrogenesis, which forms the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney that filters blood. Studying human kidney development is particularly challenging due to this structural complexity, which you can see in this digitally annotated H&E slide of a fetal human kidney, on which the different colors correspond to a different developing cell type, the limited accessibility of human fetal tissue, and the difficulty encouraging proper organ formation in laboratory models. As a result, model organisms play a critical role in both advancing our understanding of kidney development and in developing therapies for congenital kidney diseases. To better identify appropriate model species for these investigations, investigators in the Kieman lab have developed datasets of cell-level annotated H&E histological sections and corresponding 3D volumes of structures within fetal kidney tissues of mice, rhesus macaques, and humans to provide insights into convergent and divergent structural features. These datasets currently exist primarily as static images and volumetric models viewed in specific software, which can limit their accessibility and interpretability. Additionally, current educational resources describing key stages of kidney development are often limited to figures in research papers or textbooks with few didactic animations. And this thesis had two main objectives: to target these gaps in educational materials and data accessibility. This thesis presents both a series of animations describing principal stages of mammalian kidney development and a web-based interactive interface for exploration of 2D histology and 3D reconstructions of fetal mammalian kidneys, with a focus on optimizing 2D and 3D datasets for real-time interactivity and unity and facilitating cross-species comparison. In developing the animations, storyboards were created to outline key scenes, and these sketches served as important references during 3D asset development and were reviewed by advisors for clarity and accuracy. Assets were developed with Cinema 4D and rendered with Redshift. The volume builder system was used to develop realistic connected branching structures that mimicked the look of the developing renal collecting system and the developing nephron. Animations were composited in Adobe After Effects, and additional graphic elements were added to direct viewers' attention to the development of specific structures. Final animations will be uploaded and organized on the lab's website for easy accessibility, which you can see an example of on the right. And in developing the interactive interface, preliminary wireframes were developed in Figma to outline the viewer architecture and user interface location. And user interface elements, which include buttons, panels, and other background elements, were designed in Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop. These final assets were exported and imported into Unity. And because of the size and complexity of both the 2D and 3D data, they required significant optimization for real-time interactivity in Unity. And these 3D meshes representing these segmented kidney structures were exported from MATLAB as STL files and optimized using Maxon ZBrush and Cinema 4D prior to import into Unity, which decreased the number of vertices while maintaining an accurate silhouette. And you can see a before and after. The darker image, which is the developing loop of Henle of the mouse, and the lighter one is the retopologized data. And these are the same color. It's just that the wireframes are much less dense on the lighter version. These optimized kidney meshes were imported into Unity as FBX files. Each kidney is comprised of 7 to 10 unique meshes that correspond to a structure in the developing kidney. Custom Unity systems were developed to support interactive camera control, kidney mesh selection, visibility toggling, and user-controlled cross-section generation in WebGL. Each kidney also has histological images associated with structure hotspots. The final interactive platform will be hosted on the lab's website to improve the accessibility of this novel data. And this thesis produced 4 animations depicting key stages of mammalian kidney development and a web-based interactive visualization platform for exploration of 2D histology and 3D models of fetal mammalian kidneys. And these animations can be viewed online, helping to eliminate gaps in kidney development education. And like I said, the interactive will be hosted on the lab's website, and I'll briefly go through the different viewing modes. So in the single viewer mode, users can orbit, pan, and zoom into specific areas of a single kidney. Kidney structures are listed in a left-hand panel and can be isolated or highlighted from the same panel. A hover label feature allows users to more quickly ID structures within the 3D viewing panel. And a cross-section mode allows users to create unique cross-sectional cuts by selecting an axis and adjusting a UI slider, which can help reveal more information about the internal organization. And users can select from different species using a top bar in the interface. And in the comparison viewer mode, users have access to the same features as in the single viewer mode, but they are able to concurrently interact with kidney models from 2 different species to facilitate this anatomical comparison. The hover label and cross-section features work on a per viewer basis. So different axes and structures can be isolated between the two different species on screen, which you can see here. And in the histology viewer mode, a 2D H&E section of each kidney is shown alongside the 3D data. Users can explore and select unique histological structures and view the corresponding three-dimensional model, and vice versa. And the hover label and cross-section feature also work in this mode. Future directions for this project include continued refinement of interactive user interface, plans to incorporate additional data sets from more developmental time points, as all of these kidneys are from approximately the same developmental time point. And because cell level development is typically analyzed with 2D histological sections, comparing the effectiveness of these 3D reconstructions with that of traditional histological education could also inform future educational interventions involving comparative anatomy or embryological development. I would like to thank my preceptor, my faculty advisor, and all of my wonderful classmates and the faculty in the Art as Applied to Medicine. It was a question about why I chose the X, Y, and Z for the. I think it just was easier for users to understand because it was more typical of like a 3D viewing platform. But that is a good suggestion to use more anatomical references as opposed to the X, Y, and Z.
Congratulations. In addition to being very educational for users, I can imagine that some researchers with your interactive ways actually visualize the personality employees. So, in addition to education, have there been any observations with discoveries?
I think part of the goal of this project was to just make these data sets accessible, because from what I understand, there isn't a lot of information about the specific differences in these species at these developmental time points. And so, yeah, like you were saying, it would make it much easier for people to actually, this particular platform makes it easier for people to have access to this data and therefore make those observations.
Yeah, you made that all really easy. Just wondering what were some of the challenges to overcome some of
I think one of the big challenges was working with the data sets, which were really, really detailed and so therefore really, really large. And the WebGL platform has limitations to how big those files can be. So it was fun and challenging to figure out a way to retopologize those really large 3D models so that they still retained their accurate silhouette, but could actually be like played with in real time in Unity and on the actual interactive on the web browser. So I think that was probably one of the more challenging parts.
Mentioned that given the number of structures in the model,
So for each kidney, there's like one large data set that is comprised of like all of the meshes. And so I organized those in Cinema 4D so that I wouldn't have to rename them all and realign all their axes when I brought them into Unity. And so that wasn't too difficult, but what was interesting was obviously these are all much different sizes. And so I did have to make sure to scale them all to about the same size so that I wouldn't have to reset all of my camera settings in Unity. So I think that was a particular consideration for that, to avoid having to do a lot of additional work post model export. If there are no more questions, I'd like to introduce our next presenter, Katelyn Sima. Katelyn received her BA in Biological Pre-Medical Illustration from Iowa State University.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to present my thesis, Mapping Bullet Trajectories, a 3D interactive approach to ballistics and penetration trauma for diagnostic radiology education. Penetrating trauma occurs when a bullet, knife, or a piece of shrapnel creates an open wound. And radiologists evaluate the extent of these trauma injuries with imaging. CT is the gold standard for assessing ballistic injuries in hemodynamically stable patients. And these critical diagnostic decisions must be made in as few as minutes to an hour before patients go into surgery. Missed or incorrect findings are dangerous. They can lead to complications, unnecessary surgeries, or even death. Bullet trajectories can deviate from original pathways when viewed on CT. Identifying the entry and exit wounds of the injury is important, but by the time the patient gets to imaging, several factors may change the exact location and appearance of the bullet trajectory and the injuries on CT, such as the change in the body and diaphragm position at the time of injury compared to the position a patient is placed in for imaging. Radiology residents learn to diagnose penetrating trauma through case study presentations, textbook articles, annotated Paxman cases, and most importantly, hands-on training. But real-world exposure to these injuries is limited. And with a lack of emphasis on board exams, there is a need for a high-yield, accessible educational materials. To address this gap, I developed a web-based interactive case study centered on a patient with thoracoabdominal gunshot wound injuries. The module offers a guided learning experience with 3D organ models aligned with CT DICOM data. I had 4 main thesis objectives: to build a functional interactive teaching module, to explore multiple ways to visualize patient data, to identify best practices for translating medical visualization techniques into Unity for WebGL, and to evaluate the module's educational impact for a radiology resident audience. In pre-production, I conducted market research and worked with my preceptors to select a case featuring a variety of organ injury examples. I converted their case annotations into an outline covering injured structures, 3D models needed, and any interactive elements. Moving on to production, UI wireframes and storyboards were created in tandem. I sketched, scanned, and imported them into PowerPoint for easy review. The storyboards illustrated possible camera views, hotspot locations, and early approximations of the bullet's path based on the CT data. After approval from content experts, I iterated through several versions of the user interface, creating control panels, timelines, and eye-catching hotspot buttons. The final assets were created in Photoshop and uploaded into Unity. It was important not only to present the CT data across multiple modalities, but also to seamlessly allow and connect them to complement one another. The interactive uses JPEG slice sequences, 3D model segmentations, and annotated CT images. The interactive was developed in Unity using C# scripts generated in concert with ChatGPT 5.4. I had to integrate many different variables into my interactive. 742 total CT slices were modified from their original size and texture resolution for the 3D DICOM viewer. 13 3D model organ reconstructions were created, each maintaining their visual fidelity to keep the silhouette aligned with the slice data. I needed to create a custom transparent material with a dither shader graph to allow multiple organs to be stacked without flickering artifacts. And all of this content needed to be presented within 14 unique chapters along the trajectory timeline, featuring different camera views, organs, and CT slices, visible with animated transitions. This was particularly challenging as the build needed to be less than 200 megabytes to upload as a WebGL project to itch.io. To manage all of these variables, I developed a module system framework. When a user initiates an action by clicking a button or dragging a slider, the module system coordinates when and what content appears. For example, during the abdominal injury cavity timeline chapters, the spleen 3D model becomes visible. The system coordination allows the learner to receive a guided, high-yield experience while still maintaining the freedom to explore the 3D interactive at their own pace. Detailed segmentations from 3D Slicer were sculpted in ZBrush and retopologized in Cinema 4D, reducing the number of polygons from 1 million to a few thousand per model, finding the balance between preserving the silhouette and keeping the poly count low enough. For hotspot teaching content panels, assets were designed to dynamically load text and image blocks based on their hotspot ID, making content easy to update. The final prototype features several ways to explore 3D reconstructions of the CT data. The bullet trajectory and its impact upon the tissues, as you can see here, is navigated with the trajectory timeline. Users can select the hotspot buttons at each step along the trajectory to read CT descriptions and look at different annotations. Users can also toggle on and off axial, sagittal, and coronal plane slices and generally navigate the CT data as well as the 3D model reconstructions, followed by a final CT report. Before the end of development, I conducted 3 30-minute Zoom user tests with chief radiology residents. After providing brief, non-leading instructions to explore the interactive, I observed how participants progressed through the trajectory timeline and their reactions to the 3D DICOM viewer. I was primarily looking for any difficulty when interacting with buttons, camera controls, or sliders. Next steps include launching an IRB-approved study to evaluate the educational efficacy and engagement of my module across Johns Hopkins, the University of Maryland, and the American Society of Emergency Radiology. The module will be hosted on a University of Maryland radiology website. I would like to thank my preceptors, Dr. Smith and Dr. Datweiler, my advisors, Jeff and Mansan, and I would like to thank the Vesalius Trust, as well as the faculty, students, and staff of the Department of Art and Applied to Medicine. I now thank you for your attention and welcome any questions or comments. Thank you, David. Mhm.
Were you able to determine the distance that
So the question was regarding the ballistic cavities left by the bullet projectile as it went through different tissue types. And I was actually able to determine where the bullet was going through the tissue, whether it was yawing, which is a term as the bullet kind of goes over its own front half to be more sideways. It kind of rotated around the esophagus, for example. And as the bullet enters different tissue densities, such as really elastic lung tissue, it's going to have no resistance compared to a solid organ such as the spleen. Those different tissue densities are going to drastically change how the bullet is encountering the next type of tissue. And so that's what really makes it challenging. And that's something that a radiologist can certainly give me annotations on and say, this little area of grayscale is some blood coming from the spleen. But it wasn't until I segmented all of the data myself, spending hours looking at it, sliding through the different slices in all three angles, that I was able to grasp what the actual organs would have looked like in 3D space. And so it took hours of reconstruction to determine what the actual trajectory is. And in the end, I was able to create a pretty accurate representation.
Right. This is you see the applications, trying to figure out what's unknown, being able to reverse it, drag, figure out the position person,
So the question was whether or not we have technology or any idea of how to reverse what the trajectory would have looked like in real time. As of right now, I think that's something that especially the University of Maryland is trying to figure out, is if there are diagnostic ways in the moment when a patient comes into the emergency department, if they can kind of extrapolate those details. For the purpose of diagnosing on CT, and because they have so little time, I think it's more about expecting to encounter these changes and shifts in the trajectory. In my case, for example, I know that a lot of the supporting ligaments in the abdominal cavity were destroyed. And so the colon and the spleen all kind of fell and were lower. And I think that's as far as we can get right now. But I know that they're really interested in trying to figure out ways to explain how that trajectory changes, especially to their residents.
Very surprised to explain that person's decision so perhaps direction.
So the question is in regards to the kind of extreme angle changes in the trajectory as it's seen on CT data compared to a relatively straight trajectory as the bullet immediately enters the body at the time of injury. A lot of that is due to whether or not the patient has an entry wound above the diaphragm. And so as the bullet enters, let's say the chest cavity, that patient may have breathed in, and so the diaphragm would have lowered significantly. They might have been running or in a body position that was rather extreme, and so that can also shift the muscle and kind of change the angle. And then hitting different structures that are more dense, like bone, can also cause the bullet to kind of ricochet, completely change direction. And the soft tissue organs, especially in the abdominal cavity, because they don't have a shelf to sit on like the diaphragm, they will really sink, especially when they're losing that connective tissue that keeps them anchored. And so a lot of what you're seeing is a combination of the diaphragm. The person in this case was expressing their air at the time of imaging. And so their diaphragm was really high. And I think that they had taken a really deep breath. And so that counts for the first rather extreme change. And then, like I said earlier, the spleen and the colon shifting and all of the softer organs in the stomach kind of moving would account for that. But yeah, it was very surprising when I first saw it. I was very confused. But yeah.
The next project. I just had a quick question. In the initial CT images, there's a lot of metallic fragmentation outside or soft tissues outside the cavity. In the case like this, or in many cases in bullet, the fragments also penetrate and distribute within the viscera. Could this model be applied to multiple fragments or bullet fragmenting within the cavity, and how easy the trajectory of fragments after they get to the cavity?
Yeah, the question is about bullets that fragment while they're still in the body, and if this project could be used with those examples of patient case studies. We did explore a variety of cases, and I think that this project could easily be used for those cases. When the bullet hits hard structures, especially like bone. In this case, it did hit ribs, but the bullet left the body before it had the chance to. So it didn't leave any additional projectiles, but every projectile that comes off of the bullet or every piece of the bullet will create a new secondary projectile. And so all of these have to be accounted for before that patient goes into surgery. And so each of these would be treated as a new red arrow, so to speak, and could be annotated with hotspot buttons as well.
And then all of that question, do you encounter any issues with artifacts around your product, and how would that affect the trajectory?
For this case in particular, actually most of what you're seeing, I believe, is contrast fluid. I had another case study actually, which was a bullet embolization case where the bullet is traveling through a vessel, and so it's still inside the body, and you could see a lot of artifacting, and thankfully it wasn't near the site of the initial entry wound, but it does make it more difficult, especially if the scan quality is lower. But thankfully with this project, the scan was pretty nice, but yeah. Great, well, thank you very much. I would like to now introduce our final presenter, Elise Butler. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Biology from Lewis and Clark College.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming here and online. Is my volume level okay right now? Okay, excellent. So my presentation is called Designing for Health Equity, Visual Communication to Address Congenital Syphilis in Baltimore. I worked with Dr. Matthew Hamill and Jenny Fairman. Syphilis in newborns is a public health crisis. Between 2012 and 2022, cases in the United States increased tenfold. These cases disproportionately affect populations with existing health disparities. And in Baltimore, rates are 4 times the national average. Syphilis is a bacterial STI, sexually transmitted infection, which can spread to babies in utero. Parents may not know that they are infected. Congenital syphilis can cause miscarriage or stillbirth, as well as systemic illness, congenital abnormalities, and lifelong disability. Congenital syphilis is preventable. It is mandatory in many states, including Maryland, to test pregnant people for syphilis at least 3 times during prenatal care. Timely treatment with antibiotics protects the parent and the baby. So why are we seeing cases increasing? Between 5 case studies of congenital syphilis in the United States, the most identified contributors were limited access to healthcare, non-timely prenatal testing, inadequate treatment, inadequate education, stigma, and reinfection by a sexual partner. We theorized that when care is accessible, education can help address these other contributors. Care in Baltimore is accessible at low or no cost through a number of avenues, including mail order tests. An organization of note, which provides education and care coordination, is Be More for Healthy Babies, an initiative led by the Baltimore City Health Department. Patient education and communications for the initiative are coordinated by the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Programs. In 2025, Be More for Healthy Babies produced a suite of materials to increase awareness about congenital syphilis, which lead back to an informative but text-heavy webpage. We wanted to find a novel way to support the initiative that was already happening in Baltimore. My objectives were to investigate the information needs of people at risk for syphilis and congenital syphilis in Baltimore, and create animated videos to increase awareness and understanding, provide details on accessing prevention, reduce fear and stigma, motivate healthcare seeking, and initiate conversations within the community. I also had the goal to evaluate the efficacy of the videos through an IRB-approved study. My approach was theory and, My approach was theory and evidence-based and drew ideas from prior STI education, which has successfully used narrative messaging. I referred to the extended transportation imagery model, which posits that viewers are more convinced when they are absorbed in a story due to an imaginable plot, relatable characters, and believable events. I also referred to the cognitive theory of multimedia learning and used the patient education materials assessment tool for audiovisual materials, which assesses the understandability and actionability of patient education materials. I did not use this to assess my video that I produced, but I did use it as a scaffolding for how I would construct the video. My approach was also community informed. Through outreach, we informally interviewed clinicians whose practice was relevant to syphilis and congenital syphilis. Through outreach, I partnered with Be More for Healthy Babies, consulting with BCHD and the Center for Communication Programs, who had conducted audience research for their campaign. I sought feedback from my stakeholders at major checkpoints in development. I wrote scripts for 2 versions of a video, one which relied more heavily on narrative and was written as a conversation between friends, and one which contained the same content with a plain voiceover and no conversation. The introduction instead includes a couple reacting to the narration. I also wrote an abridged version of the narrative video. Each of these videos can be divided into standalone chunks, which helps with viewers' attention span and also means that they can be used individually according to the viewer's needs or the clinician who is educating a patient's needs. Once scripts were complete, I developed storyboards using Procreate and Storyboarder. I timed the boards to audio and After Effects to create an animatic. This helped us ensure that the timing and emotional beats wouldn't feel awkward. In addition to receiving stakeholder feedback, my preceptor sent this animatic out among clinicians he knew, and I had the opportunity to show it at a BCHD, Bureau of Maternal and Child Health meeting focused on congenital syphilis. I shared sketches with my preceptor and stakeholders to determine the style and format we would use for this sensitive information. I also sent character designs and preliminary graphics for approval. We made an effort to include and represent diverse people and experiences in the animated video while appealing to a target audience in Baltimore. We hoped that this would increase the characters' relatability, but we're conscious of reinforcing stigma and emphasize that anyone can get syphilis. I created my assets in Adobe Illustrator and ended up with 32 character poses, 7 background environments, and around 50 miscellaneous assets that were used throughout the video. I animated in After Effects using plugins like Duick Angela to rig and animate the characters, joysticks and sliders to animate their heads and faces, and SF Caddy to lip sync. Here's a 30-second segment of the narrative video, and I'm hoping that my audio picks up properly.
Okay, I guess it's hard to know, and it's best to be safe. What could happen to the baby?
When a baby is born with syphilis, it's called congenital syphilis. We can prevent and treat congenital syphilis. Even if you don't know you have it, syphilis can pass to your baby in the womb. Babies born with syphilis might have problems with their skin, bones, blood, and organs. They could also have brain, vision, or hearing problems.
Okay. I get
Progress to the next.
this is hard to
I can't find my mouse.
know. Okay.
There it goes. Apologies. I ultimately created 3 versions of the animation: the narrative version, the non-narrative version, and an abridged version. Several of the graphics I developed for the videos were tested by the Center for Communication Programs and were incorporated into their congenital syphilis pamphlet. Throughout outreach and production, this project and its results were received positively and enthusiastically. My visuals were incorporated into official materials, and the videos are being disseminated through official channels. This is a screenshot of the Division of Infectious Diseases newsletter, which disseminated the video, and it's also on the Johns Hopkins Medicine YouTube page. The videos were provided to Be More for Healthy Babies and the Baltimore City Health Department, and they may be iterated upon, shown in clinics, either in waiting rooms or during visits, and they are going to be available to patients online to share within their own social circles. This is also fairly recently, the video was uploaded to both the Maternal, Child, and Adolescent Health and the Sexually Transmitted Infections page for the Johns Hopkins Infectious Diseases Department. Current and future directions of this project. Currently, we are working on conducting an IRB-approved study. We've disseminated this survey through social media groups, and we're hoping that we can test the efficacy of the videos, as well as audiences' preference for the narrative version or the plain version. In the future, we may translate this video into alternate languages, including Spanish. We would also like to host them on their own independent webpage where they can be accessed by patients or healthcare providers. It would be nice to have some print resources to accompany the videos and lead back into them, like with QR codes or something like that. And we hopefully can disseminate these more broadly. I've received feedback that that is something that people think may be feasible. I'd like to acknowledge my preceptor and my advisor, as well as my voice actors, Ebony Robinson and Alexis Glasgow, everyone who participated and helped me with this, and the faculty, staff, and students of the Department of Arts Applied to Medicine and the Vesalius Trust. Thank you so much for your attention. I welcome your comments and questions. Yeah, so that was something that they did when I sent over those initial visuals, the sketches of the characters and those two, that timeline of testing during pregnancy and the 3.5 times increase in Baltimore graph. Those they took and used while they were developing this pamphlet, and they tested those with those audiences. I didn't receive the official results on those, but they were received positively, and I did get some feedback on changes that they suggested I make. So that is where that was implemented. I'm hoping in the future I can receive more feedback on the entire body of work with the videos. I was really hoping to incorporate the audience throughout this entire process, and it was just not something that was possible for us. But that is the only thing that's received official audience feedback is those two graphics that are in the BCHD pamphlet now. Thank you. No more questions. All right. Oh. Oh, that initial little thing, yeah.
And so intrigued by why you did that. So what what are the elements that cause that kind of recognition, so to speak, or cause the states that have that case?
That's a really good question. Anne's asking about the data I presented early on, which was the 5 case studies in the different states of contributors to congenital syphilis, who collected that data and what causes the variance in the contributors. So early on, I was conducting a literature review of like all sorts of different things, and I was looking for anything I could find about people's attitudes toward congenital syphilis and like what people understand, what they feel about it, and also like what is preventing people from getting into care. And a lot of the time it is access to care, which Baltimore is working on. Those are 5 different studies that they were all done a little differently. 3 of them were through interviews and focus groups, and then 2 of them were done by reviewing retrospectively the case data and people's information about like what do we know about this patient and why they were infected or remained infected or were reinfected before this baby's birth. So some of them are actually like congenital syphilis cases, what caused these, and some of them are interviewing within communities that are at risk, asking, what do you think about this? What do you feel about this? What do you think is the issue going on here? Does that address your question? Yeah. Thank you, everybody, so much.
Thank you, students, for outstanding presentations. Thanks to a great audience here. I also appreciate the first-year students in the program who've helped with the production and also the reception to come, the staff. I particularly want to thank the faculty in the department who served as advisors to the students, as well as our faculty preceptors. If you're one of the preceptors who worked with the students, please raise your hand. Thank you very much. Everyone is welcome to join us everyone who's in the room is welcome to join us at the reception. And you can talk further with the students and also see artwork that they created for other courses in the program. This is their final requirement towards graduation. So we're very, very proud of the class of 2026. The reception if you go out of the auditorium and turn to the right, there will be people helping direct you to the reception, which is, maybe about a half a block from here. And we'll see you over there. Thank you for coming today.